Hi, Misha here, and I really should be working. As I said in the recent video, there's a bit of a buying spree going on for pump shotguns. And tons of unanswered emails. But I've been working on this too before all that started. A video covering the two Bismarck class so-called fast battleships launched just before, in the early stages of World War II, by Nazi Germany. Of course, used by the Kriegsmarine. What an interesting story both of these have. We've got Bismarck over here, and Tirpitz back here. And these were the two major battleships that Germany fielded in World War II. I wish I had time to do a larger video. I just don't. I apologize. We'll probably do another visit talking more about the politics, because one thing I've noticed that's interesting, back in the 90s, the History Channel and Discovery Channel did videos, did documentaries on both of these. The perception is quite interesting versus the reality of today. I found the one on the Bismarck to be pretty fair and even, but the one on the Tirpitz seemed very skewed in favor of the German ship, as in making it out to be maybe perhaps a bigger threat than it really was, and not highlighting some of its shortcomings. And both of these did have major shortcomings, but also major benefits. I'll kind of talk about why. Well, let's jump right into it. In World War I, the Kriegsmarine had essentially the same type of navy as the Royal Navy, very comparable, and fought many battles, having many good battleships. But at the end of the war, in 1919, the Treaty of Versailles forced the Germans to scrap their navy. Extremely humiliating, and something the Navy would not forget in the future. Throughout the 20s and the Weimar era, not much happened. But in 1932, the political winds were changing. Even before the Nazi Party was officially in power, Germans were starting to think about just ignoring the Treaty of Versailles. And what's interesting, the USA and Great Britain really weren't displeased with this, at least in some degree. It was really France who had pushed it in the beginning, and yeah. So they were thinking about a new wave of battleships. And at that time, the Treaty of Washington limited all signatory powers to 35,000 tons or less. So that's where ships like the British HMS Hood, which did have 15-inch guns, and so saved on its weight by having light armor, came from, as well as many American ships. But it really didn't matter to the Germans at the time, because the Treaty of Versailles limited them to 10,000 tons, basically putting true battleships of any type, even heavy cruisers, out of their reach. Then after the Nazis took over, and then moving into 1934, Italy announced its intention to build two heavy battleships with large guns at 35,000 tons each, so right at the limit. And Germany knew that if Italy did it, the French would follow, and they were really more concerned with the French at this point than the British. The British already had large tonnage ships. Therefore, by the end of that year, they really started working on plans, and they quickly decided what they needed. Of course, they needed armor, they needed speed, it needed to be able to get up to at least 35 miles per hour. They wanted at least 8 guns. Originally, they were projecting 13-inch guns. And they needed good range. They needed good endurance, because Germany did not have direct ports on the Atlantic, and they did not have overseas bases for refueling. So it needed to be able to carry a lot of fuel, have a good range. Well, into early 1935, it was decided to upgrade the guns to 14 inches, and then in March of that year, up to 15 inches, which would be where pretty much it would stay at. They were already aware they couldn't even get to the 35,000 ton limit. They were projecting at least 40,000 tons. And then there was still the Treaty of Versailles. But the politics of the day, the Germans had a plan. They were working on a bilateral agreement, treaty with the United Kingdom, which would essentially let Germany build ships, but would restrict their overall tonnage to about 1/3 of that, slightly more than 1/3, technically 35% of the whole Royal Navy. This pretty much just threw the Treaty of Versailles out the window. And this was actually signed in June of that year, kind of giving them unofficial, official permission to go ahead. At least Britain saying they wouldn't kick up a fuss. And, you know, at this point, there was kind of an attitude about France that was not too positive. So, with that said, 2 fast battleships were planned, and their keels were both laid down in 1936. We had the Bismarck, named after Otto von Bismarck, and we had the Tirpitz, named after Admiral Tirpitz, who was the creator of the German High Seas Fleet before World War I. So what about each ship and their rather short but colorful careers? Like my other battleship models that I've shown so far, these are both 1/700 scale diecast from Forces of Valor. There are not many options in the diecast world for battleships, unfortunately. Anyway, the problem with the Bismarck class was at the very inception. In a way, it was made by committee, and of course, then Hitler would put his 2 cents in. And Hitler was admittedly completely a novice about naval affairs. But as Hitler was wont to do, this did not stop him from sticking his nose in. There basically were 3 camps as to what to make these ships. Traditional battleships, World War I style battleships, or defenders of the home waters, kind of floating artillery platforms, floating fortresses, or commerce raiders used in the Atlantic to attack convoys, shipping, and the like. So they ended up getting a little bit of each, frankly. They went with a very traditional turret style, 2 15-inch guns, and 4 turrets total. At this point in the 1930s, a lot of militaries were going to 3, maybe even 4 guns in a turret. This had several advantages, including allowing the overall ship to be shorter, having less armor on board. I mean, it's easier to protect 3 guns in one turret than, But the Germans went with this setup. They felt that it would give them more flexibility, a better firing arc, more ability to target different things. They also thought it would give them a faster rate of fire, and that it would make the turrets less vulnerable. They were afraid that if they put 3 guns in a turret, 1 hit would knock out 3 instead of just 2. The problem, too, though, was that meant the supply chains to 4 turrets were longer on the ship, meaning more room for explosions and whatnot. That was the main battery. The secondary battery consisted of 12 6-inch guns. Again, 2 per turret, so 6 turrets. located on 3 on each side. These were very good defense against things like destroyers and cruisers. However, they weren't really dual purpose. Certainly in the 1930s and by the 1940s, many other navies were going to ships that had more multi-purpose guns. Them thinking more of air defense, but the Germans were just thinking about other sea vessels. Now, they did have plenty of anti-aircraft guns. They had some 4-inchers, they had some 1.5-inchers, they had 37mm cannon. All told, at launch, the Bismarck had 72 major guns. So they weren't hurting for guns. Overall, the ship was 823 feet, about 1/6 of a mile. It was about 118 feet wide, which was good. This actually let it be very stable, even in choppy seas. It didn't have a lot of pitch and roll. Now, one thing, it was powered by 3, not 4 shafts, propellers. This was done to save on weight, which it did, but it had problems. It led to a compromised rudder system. It also meant that the center shaft was right through the keel, which obviously when you stick something in where it's otherwise supposed to be a solid piece, you weaken it, which meant the whole stern was frankly compromised. It was expected to do 35 miles per hour. At sea trials, the maximum the Bismarck was able to get to was 34.9, so just shy of what it needed. It was equipped with radar, which was pretty good for the day. It had a lot of armor. The deck armor was very strong, the side armor strong, and the bottom of the hull, for over 80%, was a double hull on the bottom. Very good. And to get that extra range and endurance, using extra fuel storage, bunkers as they were called, it could hold about 7,400 tons of fuel, giving it a respectable range and endurance at cruising speed, but still limited. It would carry several smaller craft on board, little boats and things, but its main complement were 3 Arado AR-196 Reconnaissance aircraft. This is a 172 scale model from, I think this one's from Atlas. I just grabbed it on the way out here. It's a float plane. Basically, these would be launched by catapult and then would land in the sea to be recovered. They were just armed lightly with a couple of 8mm machine guns and a couple of 20mm cannon. They could also carry a couple of light bombs, but they were reconnaissance planes. The problem is with these, with float planes, really to use them, you had to have pretty good weather. You did not want to be trying to land one of these in choppy oceans and also pick one up with a crane. It wasn't good. But it did have them on board. Overall, the crew was nearly 2,000 crew, enlisted, sailors, whatever, and just over 100 officers. So, roughly speaking, around 2,100 people. Of course, it could carry more if needed, but its main guns were quite impressive, although not unheard of. Like I said, the HMS Hood also had 15-inch guns. They were kind of the big guns of the day, although by World War II, 16-inch would be the new standard, and of course the Japanese would even have 18. But nevertheless, these guns could fire over a 1,900-pound, nearly 1-ton shell, and thanks to the radar, had a range of nearly 20 miles. So I don't want to say she was not a formidable battleship. She had good speed, she had very modern guns, she had very good armor, but she was kind of designed at cross purposes. Nevertheless, the keel was laid down on July 1st of 1936, and the hull was officially launched on February 14th, 1939, where the granddaughter of Otto von Bismarck christened it, and Hitler made one of his interminable, high-pitched speeches. But launching just means the hull is ready. She still had to be fitted out, which took the rest of that year, and into 1940. By August, the Bismarck was done being fitted out. By the way, the Germans always referred to it as he, not she, because, yeah, Germans. So, he, which just feels weird to say about ships, was officially commissioned into service on the 24th of August, 1940, and then was sent in September for a round of sea trials in the Baltic. After a bit of shakedown and testing, went back to port in December for final fitting out, correcting things, just post-shakedown cruise stuff. And then he was sent early, or late winter, I should say, of 1941, back to the Baltic for final trials with the new refits and installations. Finally placed on active service in May, and it would leave port on May 19th for its first and frankly only operation, the Rhine exercise, or Operation Rhine. The plan was to send a battle group initially with the Bismarck, Tirpitz, the two Scharnhorst class battleships, and several cruisers and destroyers for escort into the Atlantic to work as commerce raiders for a time. But the Tirpitz was not ready yet. One of the two Scharnhorst ships was damaged on a bombing raid. Basically ended up being whittled down to the Bismarck and the heavy cruiser I can't talk today, I apologize, Prince Eugene, basically, in German. Eugene, I believe. So yeah, one heavy cruiser to escort her, and that was it. By May 21st, this was getting to the Denmark Straits. They did stop at a port, but Bismarck did not refuel. Eugen did. And then, on May 24th, the Battle of the Bismarck Straits happened. Essentially, it began when two British cruisers spotted the two German ships. They engaged them briefly, just a few pot shots, and then they dropped back to trail them and just keep an eye on them. The next day, the older but still proud of the Navy ship, HMS Hood, very similar in a lot of ways, size and gun-wise, to the Bismarck, but much lighter armor, along with a very newly commissioned ship, the HMS Prince of Wales, considered a battleship, would be spotted by and spot the Bismarck and the Prince Eugen, and they would engage. The British would sail straight for them. They were just getting some shots off. The British were maneuvering. They wanted to make a turn and kind of come alongside parallel to get all their guns. And it was over. One of the 15-inch shells from Bismarck hit the ammunition magazine of HMS Hood, tearing through its light armor, and it exploded nearly immediately. Only 3 sailors survived. It was a catastrophe. So that left Prince of Wales alone. To be fair, she did fight for a time, but 2 against 1, and she even did get one good hit in on the Bismarck, which actually would prove to be the beginning of the end, really. Although they did not know that at the time. It was a good hit, a good solid hit on the bow of the ship. It did allow the ship to take on water and also start leaking oil. But repair crews were quickly at work and put a temporary patch on it. And the Prince of Wales would disengage. It would fall back and meet up with the 2 British cruisers and then call in reinforcements. They sunk the Hood, and they had to pay. Basically, even though she was a bit of an old ship at this point, 20 years old, it was iconic to the British. Very romantic in their society. And so a flotilla of 19 ships was quickly assembled. There would be 6 full battleships, 2 aircraft carriers, Victorious and Ark Royal, and the rest would be cruisers, destroyers, and the like. The idea was basically for Bismarck to go ahead and return to port to repair its damage, and the Prince Eugen would return, and not return, but it would go back on course, return to course, and go into the North Atlantic and start working as a commerce freighter. It was a heavy cruiser. It could do the job. So her escort left, and being close to home, they thought they were alright. They did kind of do some maneuvers, try to shake off the British, but a few things would happen. They would send some radio transmissions letting Germany know of their status. The British would intercept them, and while this did not give them a real good fix, it gave them an idea. To that end, swordfishers were sent out from first HMS Victorious, and right before midnight on the 24th, a wing of them found the Bismarck. And while most torpedoes missed, one did hit. It in and of itself did not do a lot of damage, although it was a good hit, but what it did, it ripped the band-aid off the repairs. It aggravated an already existing wound, plus adding a little more just because. This had the effect of reducing top speed to under 20 miles per hour, which really up until this point, she was quite close to home. So with low fuel, leaking fuel, a couple of wounds, and German ports being a little far away, the decision was taken to head for France, which was recently occupied by the Germans. And so she changed course, but she was being followed. Early the next morning, a Catalina flying boat spotted the crippled but still very much alive and dangerous Bismarck. And that afternoon, a flight of swordfish from Ark Royal, who was the only vessel in range at the time, were sent, but unfortunately they missed the target completely, actually accidentally trying to torpedo a fellow British ship, but luckily no damage was really done. Failing, I guess if you don't succeed, try again. Around 8 p.m. on the 26th, another flight was sent out. 15 swordfish went out, and 3 torpedoes found their target. While 2 of them were good solid hits, they didn't really do a lot of damage, because again, we have good armor on this ship. The third did the infamous damage to the rudders, sticking them in a pretty hard starboard turn. And just for fun, here is a scale of the Bismarck's nemesis. Maybe. There is a 1/700 scale swordfish that twice attacked the Bismarck and scored a total of 4 torpedo hits from 2 British carriers. And here is a swordfish 172 scale, just so you can look at it. Maybe if I can pick it up right. This is actually this was a set with that Arado. I've shown you this before in another video. Good airplane, string bag. Done a full video on it if you're interested. So with her rudder jammed, even though she was quite close to safety, where German U-boats and aircraft could protect her, because it was jammed, she actually turned in a circle and headed back towards the pursuing British ships. And at this point, that evening, they knew it was lost. The captain telegraphed to Germany, basically saying ship was unable to maneuver, but we will fight to the last shell on board. Heil Hitler. Yay. It's interesting to point out that the German Navy was pretty apolitical. Grand Admiral Reich really didn't like politics. So it was only political when it absolutely had to be. The next morning at 8 a.m., the British battleship HMS Rodney, I like to think of Rodney McKay whenever I say that, fired the first shots on Bismarck, and Bismarck returned in kind. Soon, other ships from the Royal Navy would join in, and it would be an all-out fight, but only quite briefly, frankly. By 9 o'clock, both of her forward turrets were knocked out, and by 9:30, both of her aft turrets were disabled, and since she was up against fellow battleships, they were pretty much able to stay out of range of her smaller guns like the 6-inchers. They would continue to pound on her for a bit longer, but they would cease fire at 10:15. She was a burning hulk and obviously no longer a threat. And sailors don't like killing other sailors. They like disabling ships. There's a code of the sea that's really true. So they stopped fire. A British cruiser would be pulled up, and she would send torpedoes into the side. And they would hit, of course, letting the ship take on water, starting a very pronounced list, which would have eventually led to her capsizing. But at the same time, the German crew placed scuttling charges in and around the engine room and detonated them, blowing it up. So they knew it was lost, so they basically self-destructed. Sadly, there were only 115 survivors of a crew of around 2,100. 110 were rescued by the British fleet. They would have rescued more, but U-boats were coming and they had to get out of the area. The U-boats, once they got there, rescued another 5, but by that point, people had either drowned, succumbed to injuries, or never even made it out of the ship, because obviously she went down pretty quick as a flaming hulk. And that was the end of the KMS Bismarck. Her career active service lasted just over a week. Like I said, she left port on May 19th, and by 10:30 in the morning on May 27th, she was at the bottom of the ocean. And the Ark Royal, the Rodney, and others avenged her sinking of the Hood. With that said, what about her sister ship, the Tirpitz? Both models are 1/700 scale, quote-unquote diecast, both from Forces of Valor. In this instance, the diecast is the hull, with the top and all the fine details being plastic. It's pretty good, flexible plastic. It's not just super duper brittle. You really have to do plastic on this scale and this size to get the detail you want. If you tried to make the top out of metal, it would be very soft looking, and it would be very toy looking probably. I've moved the turrets for you. They do move. A few other pieces rotate on these models as well. The main turrets rotate. You can also elevate the 15-inch cannon, the secondary batteries, the 6-inch guns. Yes, I know they're actually 5.9, but yeah. The turrets rotate, but I don't believe the cannons elevate. They're probably too small for that. Let's see here. They stay up or down pretty well. Turrets rotate pretty easily, and also stay in place. When you get these, they do not have the rudders and propellers installed. They just plug in, so you don't have to glue them, but they recommend it. They even supply a little tube of super glue, which I don't use. I still prefer using real modeling glue. So that's something you need to assemble. Everything else comes though. They also come with this stand, which is partly metal. The legs, or I guess, what do you want to call them? The plinths, pedestals, I guess that's the right word, are metal. The base is plastic, meant to look like wood, with a little nameplate on there. They also come with a little water line diorama you can set them in, which is okay. It's a little chintzy looking, but it gets the job done. The Bismarck came out first, and it's known to have some issues, mostly with canted parts. My front antenna or mast ready to cause a little bent. Might try to heat it one day, but I don't want to break it off, so I'll probably just leave it as is. Otherwise, it's a nice model. They also have a 1/1000 scale Bismarck, so if you buy one, make sure you buy the size you want. The Tirpitz came out more recently, and seems to be more issue-free. I think they've tightened up their quality control. More straight. The turrets are a little stiffer too, I've noticed. But yeah, for what these cost, they're pretty nice models, and they're a good size, big enough for detail, but not so big that you can't fit multiples on a shelf. And since there's really no one else doing battleships in 1/700 scale diecast, you know, options are limited. You can find small 1,250 from like Eagle Moss or Atlas, but those are pretty tiny. And you can find some real expensive 1/350 scale, but those are $300, $400, $500. Some of them are even over $1,000 if they're like aircraft carriers. So this is a good splitting the difference between feature, size, value, and also having some, you know, moving parts. It's kind of nice. You can move the turrets. It's either if you want to position it more in cruising or set up a battle. You can point its guns at various things. But mostly I just enjoy these for the history that they that they represent. I'm going to drop you. As for the Tirpitz, her keel was laid down shortly after that of Bismarck on October 20th, 1936, and she was first launched on April 1st, 1939, and fitting out was complete by February 25th, 1941. She would undergo sea trials in both the North Atlantic and the Baltic, and then she would very quickly have a round of training, and then her first posting in active service when commissioned was basically to act as a deterrent to bottle up the Russian fleet after war occurred with them. It's a very similar ship. It's still a Bismarck class, but it's a bit heavier. The original Bismarck was about 41,000 tons light and 49.5 heavy. The Tirpitz was about a little over 42,000 tons light and just a little under 52,000 heavy. She also carried more fuel and had different makes of engine. Speaking of the engines, originally they wanted to use turbo-electric power. They did examine diesel and steam as well, but they wanted the new electric-powered ones, and that's what they were going to go with. They even had a contractor, but at the very last minute, that contractor pulled out, leaving the German Kriegsmarine at a lurch, and so they very quickly had to retrofit it to take steam, high-pressure steam turbines. And so the ones on Tirpitz were a bit different. Armament was virtually the same when launched. Had about the same crew. Still carried 3 of these 196 patrol planes. Scout planes, Reconnaissance. But did have a few improvements. For example, the radar was slightly better than the Bismarck's. But yeah, she had a few patrols in or near German waters. It was mostly used as a deterrent in 1941. But then after the disaster with the Bismarck, Hitler seemed reluctant to really put Tirpitz in peril. So she actually did not leave German waters again until January of 1942, meaning nearly her first year was spent doing, sorry guys, don't mean to jostle you, doing little of nothing. They were starting to get cautious. Here we have a same scale model, 1/700 of what the German Kriegsmarine, the German Navy, is probably better known for, a U-boat. Thought I would show you, just to give a scale to the Tirpitz herself. Well, a few days after leaving German waters, Tirpitz would arrive in Norway, and different fjords and things, it would kind of be her home. She was stationed there to act as a deterrent against the Royal Navy's fleet, and really just be a nuisance, a threat. Almost a Chekhov's gun, waiting to go off. Certainly bothered Churchill quite a bit. She was also there to be a commerce raider against convoys from the United Kingdom to Soviet Russia after the wars opened up. Britain would help supply, through Lend-Lease and others, airplanes of both British and American make, as well as tanks and weapons to Russia. And she did at first go after some convoys. Some successfully. She did sink some convoys. There was a major raid planned on March 6th. But afterwards, HMS Victorious, the carrier, sent a dozen torpedo bombers after Tirpitz. And I think, recalling what happened with the earlier Swordfish bombers, Hitler ordered Tirpitz back to port. She returned there around March 12th and really stayed there. The British Navy launched several attacks on her throughout that spring, but really none were successful. A lot of times the anti-aircraft, German fighters, and frankly just bad weather. They had a really bad luck with weather. And then they decided to refit Tirpitz. The problem is, where she was located in Norway, where she was anchored, where she was docked, her port had no dry dock facilities. So they basically had to build temporary facilities to make the changes and whatnot. One major change they went for was to replace and update the rudders. Obviously, that was the failure point on the Bismarck. Obviously, they couldn't go to a whole new system, but they could at least do some changes to try to make sure it couldn't happen again. That was a major undertaking. Huge, in fact. They also upgraded its anti-aircraft abilities. They added about half a dozen new guns and relocated some of the existing guns for better placement. Things like that. And the refit was pretty much done by January of 1943. A very long, exhausting process. And she was sent on training exercises, simulated combat with other members of the Kriegsmarine fleet that spring and summer, but really not given a lot to do. Finally, in September, Tirpitz, along with other ships, were sent to attack a British refueling depot on the island of Spitsbergen. And they carried it out very successfully. They destroyed all their primary targets. And this was really the first time that Tirpitz was able to use its big guns and anger and bombardment and really show what it could do. But this is also late 1943, and the war is starting to really turn against the Axis. Really, even after the beginning of the first attacks, Hitler ordered that the Tirpitz no longer engage convoys, no longer go as a commerce raider. He was afraid that the escorting aircraft carriers could take it out. So his order was simple. Only go after the convoy ships if and when you've destroyed the British carrier, which obviously tied the Tirpitz's hand a lot. Meanwhile, its crew having years of inactivity, were just losing their edge. And the ship, while glorious when first made in the late 30s, I'm not going to say it was starting to look outdated by 1943. I mean, it's heavy armor, it's quite big guns, were still very much formidable, but the battleship concept itself was becoming outdated, if that makes sense. That said, she was still a threat in the North Sea and the Arctic regions, and she still worried Churchill and the British Admiralty. Plans for the D-Day invasion were well underway, and they were afraid that if the Germans got wind of it, they could send Tirpitz and the rest of the fleet in and really make a big threat. They were also not aware of how reluctant the Germans, namely Hitler, were to use this as a convoy raider, so there was always a constant worry about that, even though she actually raided a handful of convoys. The threat was ever present. So with that in mind, and after the raid on their fueling station, the British got serious about helping Tirpitz join her sister ship at the bottom of the sea. Well, one of the first and most out-of-the-box thinking attacks against the Tirpitz came on September 22nd, when the British attacked it with 6 midgets. 6 midget submarines, that is. Of the 6, 2 of them were able to place explosive charges on under the hull, and these did significant damage to the port side. But of course it's still in its port and its dock, so immediately a major repair operation was undertaken, using over 1,000 men. Unfortunately, the British did not capitalize on the disabling of the Tirpitz. They pretty much left it alone that fall and winter. So by March, the repairs were complete. And then in April, the the Royal Navy got serious again. They sent 40 torpedo bombers escorted by 40 fighters against it. And they actually managed to do pretty decent damage again. They hit it 15 times, causing her to take on water, but not sinking her, just damage. And again, repairs were affected. There were several either aborted or ineffective raids throughout April and May because of bad weather. Also, the Germans had smokescreen generators to protect this, as well as anti-aircraft fire. In one raid in late April, they did score a couple of near misses, and these were important because they pressed the water into the damaged sections and actually caused even more water to be taken on board the Tirpitz. So doing damage. But then it's time for D-Day, so she's left alone for June. But then on July 27th, 3 carriers are assigned as a task force to sink the Tirpitz, and they have several raids, but most again were very ineffective. On the 1 or 2 occasions they would hit, doing minor damage, but really not much. The Royal Navy's last attempt against the Tirpitz was on August 29th. But it was clear that carrier-based torpedo and dive bombers with a relatively light load just weren't going to cut it, especially with this one sheltered in a fjord, not out on the open water like the Bismarck had been. They quickly realized that the Bismarck had just been a stroke of luck. So the job was given to the Royal Air Force, the RAF. And they had a new weapon, a new toy, the Tallboy Bomb. It was nearly 12,000 pounds, filled with the most modern, most effective, most blowy-uppiest explosives that Britain had. And it was to be dropped from 15 to 20,000 feet in the air so that it would go supersonic, and was designed to punch through armor plating, including the armored deck of a ship like this. Obviously, hitting a ship from that high up is not easy, especially if there's anti-aircraft fire and whatnot. But if it were hit, even a near miss could do some really bad damage. So on the first raid, we had 27 Lancaster bombers actually flying out of Archangel, Russia, because British RAF bases were just out of range. And the Germans did employ their smoke screen, plus anti-aircraft fire. And even though the Lancasters were ordered not to drop their bombs unless they were sure, because the bombs were expensive and new and everything else, they disobeyed orders and dropped them anyway. And one got lucky. It hit the bow and really hurt the ship. But she was still afloat, but she had a big hole in her because a 12,000 pound bomb, even if it was just dead weight, would hurt coming from that height. With the explosive in it as well, it was bad. So the ship was disabled effectively. Problem is, it was still out of RAF base range, so were they going to fly from Russia again? Well, on October 15th, Hitler ordered the Tirpitz moved to a nearby island to act as essentially a floating fortress, a floating artillery battery. And this was a stroke of great luck for the British, because it was now within range of English bases. And of course, on top of that, this is post D-Day, and they're advancing ever more into Europe. Seeing the advantage and not wanting to waste it, as the Navy had done with the midget attack that was kind of left too long to take advantage of, the RAF sent 32, so even a larger force of Lancasters with Tallboys against her, on October 29th. Unfortunately, this time they all missed, but this was in relatively shallow water, so a near miss would go and hit the bottom, hit the water and explode, and it would exacerbate the damage that was already on the ship before repairs really had even been begun. And so she would take on even more water. At this point, I'm wondering if this was a battleship or more of a submarine or even an aquarium. She's taken on a lot of water in her life. So she's more wounded. Not exactly a glowing success, but they're definitely whittling away at her health points. Her HP is definitely going down. Well, finally, on November 12th, another raid of 32 Lancasters is sent against Tirpitz, and this time, pretty much all the luck's on British side. First off, they get great weather, which is important because November 12th, daylight is pretty brief in the north, and weather gets pretty terrible. So the fact that they had clear skies and all that in mid-November was already a minor miracle. At its new location, while it was being set up, it didn't have a smoke screen. There wasn't really the altitude, the mountains, to really put one up like they'd had in the fjord before. But they did have their own anti-aircraft guns, which, as I said, had been bolstered during a refit. And they had a couple of squadrons of Messerschmitt Bf-109s on standby to defend her if there was a bombing raid. So she had air cover, which, honestly, this late in the war was pretty good. I mean, look at the invasion of Normandy. The Luftwaffe was essentially gone. So the fact that they afforded the Tirpitz very respectable air cover shows a lot. So the Lancasters come in, they're spotted, air cover is called in to protect the Tirpitz, and nothing. The Messerschmitts, for one reason or another, went to the wrong fjord, the wrong little inland slip. So when the Lancasters got there, the only thing protecting Tirpitz were its own AA guns. No smokescreen, no fighters, no other ships. And she's already damaged and pretty much in a position where she cannot maneuver, and she's in relatively shallow water. They let loose. Clear sky. Excellent conditions. Some pilots said it was like a training exercise. It was so just straightforward. 32 Tallboys were dropped. 2 made direct hits, and 1 was a near miss, doing damage itself. One of the 2 direct hits popped the Tirpitz's ammunition magazine, and there was a ginormous explosion. And that was it. The RAF got the job done, and it took them just under 2 months. The Royal Navy had tried for over half a year. And I'm a big fan of the Royal Navy, so I'm not dogging on them, but, the right tool for the right job. The Royal Navy had smaller, more agile bombers, capable of more tactical use, whereas the RAF had large. The Lancaster was a beast of a bomber, and the Tallboy, it's just not something the Navy would have had. They had more strategic bombers, and frankly, more experience doing it. So they were the right tool for the job, obviously. Luckily, too, people died, of course, more than half the crew. But whereas only 115 survived the Bismarck, 888 crew survived the Tirpitz. So it wasn't quite the same massacre. Now, part of this was because it was in shallow water, so some crew were rescued from the capsized hull, but many were able to get off the ship and swim away because they didn't have that giant suction that a ship would have had in deep water. And of course, they weren't out in sea, so land was nearby, including German assistance. As I said, when the Bismarck sunk, no one wants to kill sailors. They were just doing their job. And again, the German Kriegsmarine was not Nazi to the core like some of the other things like the SS. They were just kind of German patriots, and a lot of them. Not trying to be an apologist, but just trying to be realistic. And that was the end of the 2 largest battleships built for Nazi Germany. And really, the 2 biggest, most advanced battleships built for the Atlantic, for the European theater. If you go to the Pacific, of course, you have the Yamato and the Musashi, as well as American ships like the Missouri. They were bigger. But for the Atlantic theater, for the European, this was about as big as it got. Even the Royal Navy ships were only about equal to, not really better. On the other hand, the Bismarck's career was less than a week and a half And the Tirpitzes, while she did survive for nearly 4 years, frankly, it was a very uneventful career because they played it too safe after losing the Bismarck. So even though it was an effective warship, it was never really given a chance to show its stuff. Now, part of that, too, was warfare was changing. By 1944, there weren't the battleships lining up side by side, parallel to each other, duking it out 19th century style, or even World War I style. This was the era of the airplane, the aircraft carrier, the bomber, and even the submarine. Submarine definitely changed warfare, where you could have a small, relatively inexpensive boat that's pretty stealthy. One sub can take out a battleship like this. The only reason the Tirpitz probably wasn't attacked more with subs was when it was in its port, it had submarine nets. They put nets across where subs couldn't get in. The midget subs slipped in because they were so small behind other German vessels as they were going in and out of the gate, out of the lock. Otherwise, they wouldn't have got in. But if it had been on the open seas, the story could have been very different. Well, let's have some final thoughts, and then I'll wrap things up. So, final thoughts on the history of the Bismarck class, both the namesake and its sister ship. Germany, specifically Nazi Germany, Hitler, wanted these not really for a military purpose. Again, they couldn't even make up their mind why they wanted them, what to use them for. Battleship, commerce, raider, defense. It was a political statement more than anything else. It said that the German Navy is back. It also says we are no longer listening to the Treaty of Versailles or even the Washington Treaty. That Germany is a power again. So for that, these were built as symbols. And that's why after losing the Bismarck, they were so cautious with the Tirpitz to its detriment. Kind of like you saw with the Yamato. These countries put so much into these battleships, and only having a couple, they become very shy about using them. Because it's all they could really do. I mean, for all intents and purposes, this was the surface fleet of the Kriegsmarine. They had cruisers and a few other smaller battleships, but not really anything like this. What was much more practical for them were its submarines, its U-boats. Much cheaper, more effective. And one U-boat could take out a ship like this with a lucky torpedo hit. And it only takes one. But it's a really interesting history. I do think the whole Nazi German mystique kind of clouds people's judgment about the reality of these ships because they were flawed. Yes, they were great, they were impressive, but they were also deeply flawed in concept and execution. And that's why the Bismarck was sunk so quickly and the Tirpitz was never really utilized. So with that said, I'm going to call it a day. Hope you enjoyed this. Hope you thought it was worth doing a long video on two. I thought the two ships are so closely linked that to do justice, you really have to talk about them together because they are sister ships. With that said, I greatly appreciate it if you could like, share, and subscribe. And if you like big guns, check out our main channel over at Mishaco. This is Misha, and I'll catch you very soon next time.